Chapter 28, the Civil Rights Movement. We're going to start today by talking about battling school segregation. Now, a couple chapters ago, we talked about a Supreme Court case that happened in 1896 called Plessy versus Ferguson that established the idea of separate but equal doctrine. Basically what that means is that you can have segregation, but you had to have equal facilities for both whites and blacks, and they had to be equal. In reality, that never happened. Segregated schools were not equal. Anything with segregation were really pretty much not equal. This cartoon right here kind of shows you, kind of exaggerated, but it's true. The white side, like it's all water coming out, free-flowing water, angels and harps, and this fancy schmancy water fountain. And then you have the black side, which is a pump water fountain from a well. So they were separate, whites and blacks, but they were not equal. As I mentioned, schools were segregated. You have a white school and a black school for those students, and usually the black students and their black schools were not equal. They usually received less funding than the white schools, which means that they had run-down school buildings, they had no supplies or materials, they didn't have any textbooks. They were not the same as white schools. So some leaders of the NAACP, which stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, they started to do battle in the courts about this whole idea of segregation. So the case became known as Brown versus the Board of Education of Kansas. And it involved a 7-year-old African-American girl named Linda Brown from Topeka, Kansas. Linda lived near a school for white children, but since she was African-American, she had to travel across town to a school for black children. And what Linda Brown's father and the NAACP did was sued to allow Linda to attend a school closer to her home. On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court issued a unanimous decision that segregation in public schools was illegal. And later in the year, the court ordered that all public schools had to segregate. So in the South, only 3 school districts began to desegregate in 1954. Most of the other schools would implement integration slowly into their plans. One of these areas was Little Rock, Arkansas. The school board decided to start integrating one of their high schools, which was called Central High School. And they invited 9 outstanding black students to attend Central High School, and they became known as the Little Rock Nine. The governor wasn't really thrilled about this, and he worked to prevent desegregation at Central High School. His name was Orville Faubus. And he tried to prevent the students from entering by using the National Guard to block the students from entering the school building. On the morning of September 4th, 1957, 8 of the 9 students arrived at the school together and were turned away by the National Guard. A 9th student, Elizabeth Eckford, who you see here, will arrive by herself, and she was blocked from entering the school. And when she turned around, she's facing a screaming mob out here saying that they want to lynch her. Lynch her! Finally, a man and a woman helped Eckford to safety. Now, President Eisenhower will send federal troops down to Little Rock to escort the students into the school building. And 8 of the 9 Little Rock 9 students will remain at school. The 9th one will eventually drop out. And in May 1954, Ernest Green will become the first African-American student to graduate from Central High School. Now, Elizabeth Eckford is in this picture here, and you can see this woman right here screaming at her some horrible, horrible things. This is Elizabeth Eckford in modern times, and this woman here is this girl right here who was screaming at her, and she officially apologized for any of her bad behaviors that happened way back when. The victory in Brown versus the Board of Education was just a part of a larger struggle to end segregation in all public places. So here's an example of this, and this is the Montgomery Bus boycott. In Montgomery, Alabama, black passengers were required to sit in the back of the city buses. And if a white person needed a seat, they were to get up to allow the white person to sit in the seat. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to move from her seat. And you can tell on the bus here, she was kind of sitting kind of closer to the front. And she refused to get up for a white passenger. And so the bus driver pulled over, called the police, and Rosa Parks was arrested. Local leaders, like an African American professor named Joanne Robinson, organized a boycott of the Montgomery bus system. And as it started getting bigger, a young African American Baptist minister named Martin Luther King Jr. helped with this boycott of the bus system. And a little over a year later, in November of 1956, the Supreme Court will rule that segregation on public transportation was illegal. Like schools and buses, public businesses were also segregated. You could have a segregated restaurant where only white people could sit near the front, or the black people had to sit in the back of the room. And this, an example we're about to talk about, in Greensboro, North Carolina, there was a department store called Woolworth's who had a lunch counter, and the counter itself was for whites only. But one day, on February 1st, 1960, four students went into this Woolworth's and sat down in the whites only area and staged something called a sit-in, which is a demonstration in which protesters sit and refuse to leave. They ordered coffee, and of course, the person behind the counter refused to serve them, so they just sat there until the store closed, and they left. The next day, they arrived at opening with a dozen more students who would sit down and block the restaurant.